我觉得台湾的跨性别目前生活其实都算蛮低调的耶。我不希望人家知道我是跨性别，越少人知道越好。
What kinds of problems can you foresee with trying to attain trans rights?
So there's always a disconnect between law and policy. We have fairly strong anti-discrimination laws in this country, so you can't treat trans people differently just because they're trans. But the government keeps trying to introduce policies around education and around bathrooms.
In the lead up to the recent presidential and parliamentary elections, we didn't really see trans issues or many LGBTQ plus issues on the whole being discussed. Why do you think it's so different here, Poe? Hello, and welcome to Connected. I'm Brian Cragen, sitting in for Divya Gopalan. In February 2023, 16-year-old Brianna Ghey was murdered by two of her peers in the UK. Almost a year later, 16-year-old Nex Benedict died by suicide a day after a brutal beating in a school bathroom in the United States. Both teens identified as gender nonconforming, with Ghey describing herself as transgender and Benedict as non-binary. Over the past few years, there has been an increase in anti-LGBTQ plus hate crimes and legislation in many countries around the world. One group that has been targeted the most is the transgender community. May 17th is the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia, and that is why we're here to discuss transgender rights with Dr. Flora Renz, Senior Lecturer at Law at the University of Kent and co-director for the Center of Sexuality, Race, and Gender Justice in Canterbury, UK, and in London, Poe, a Taiwanese graduate student at the London School for Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and former Taiwan Tongzhi Hotline volunteer. Thank you both for joining us today. So to start out the conversation today, I know, Flora, a lot of your work and your research is focused on the legality of gender. Can you tell us exactly what that means?
Yes, so my work has initially started by looking at how people engage with laws that allow them to legally change their gender marker on their birth certificate in the UK, as well as in some other countries like Germany. So it's really about people's personal experience of going through these legal processes. And then more recently, I've looked at what would happen if we no longer had gender markers. So if we went kind of in the opposite direction and said, actually, this doesn't matter anymore. No one needs to change anything because it simply stops existing as a legal formality in the same way that we don't legally have a race or a sexual orientation, for instance.
I see. And Poe, you yourself have experience as a transgender man living both here in Taiwan as well as in the UK. Can you tell us how the environment feels different between the two countries?
Sure. I'll say as long as I came to London to study my master, I did realize that I don't need to explain what is transgender that much to people. So when I start a conversation, when I introduce myself, I usually just need to say, oh, I identify as trans, and then I don't need to start from ABC, what's trans, like what's assigned gender. Yeah, that's what I first encountered here.
To better understand the reality faced by transgender people in Taiwan and around the world, let's get some data. The US Department of Justice says that since they started keeping records of transgender hate crimes in 2013, the overall number of anti-LGBTQ plus crimes has increased dramatically. The pink in this graph represents transgender victims, and it's important to remember that many crimes in this category likely go unreported. If we look at the percentage of trans people among victims of anti-LGBTQ plus hate crimes, we can see a terrifying trend that trans people are now disproportionately more likely to be targeted. Flora, looking at the murder of Brianna Ghey last year, it caused quite a bit of an upstir in the UK, but did it change anything?
So it's a really difficult conversation to have, I think, in lots of ways, because the official decision in the case, the judge said she was not murdered because she was a transgender girl or transgender woman, really. But it was part of the motive for the killers who'd planned to kill other people, but they started with her. And we can perhaps assume that was because she was seen as uniquely vulnerable or a uniquely good target for this kind of violence. And it was quite interesting because this happened at a time when the political discourse in the UK, so what politicians were saying about trans people, was often very negative, particularly from the ruling party and the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. And in fact, Brianna Ghey's mother was in Parliament during a discussion where some very upsetting transphobic comments were made, and she was sitting in the gallery. And the leader of the opposition called for the Prime Minister to apologize for that, which never really happened. So I think in some ways this has helped raise awareness of how bad things can be for transgender people in this country that claims to be very progressive and very inclusive. But I'm not sure if it's fundamentally changed how politicians approach this issue. I think it's raised some sympathy, but the politics behind it haven't changed.
Po, in Taiwan, we don't see as many high-profile hate crimes against members of the trans community, or at least maybe they're not reported on nearly as much. Do you think that that means that they aren't happening to the same degree we're seeing in other countries, or they're just underreported?
I'll say, firstly, like in Taiwan, we don't really have that much like physical attack against like LGBT people. So on that basis, I'll say maybe Taiwan do have a better like environment, but still discrimination still happens in other ways, like verbally, in working spaces, in schools, and also because there's not that much information about trans people, so there's not that much public conversation or discourse happening. So that's why like these transgender hate crime isn't like seeable in Taiwan, because when there's really discrimination, that also doesn't goes on the TV or goes on the newspaper. So I'll say that's why we have these like difference from like Western country to Taiwan.
That's an interesting point that you brought up about the hate crimes not being as prevalent in Taiwan. Taiwan currently doesn't have a clear anti-hate crime law on the books. Flora, do you think that generally speaking, having these kinds of anti-hate crime or anti-discrimination laws help deter people from committing these kinds of crimes?
I'm always a little bit skeptical when we argue that criminal law in particular is the answer to social issues. We've had hate crime laws in the UK for a number of what are called protected characteristics, so kind of what makes you a minority in society, for quite a long time now, and they certainly haven't worked at deterring, say, racialized violence. So I would be skeptical to say that they're going to deter violence against trans people, but they may have a symbolic value. So it's important for the government to say, we do not condone this, this is not allowed. I think that has a value in and of itself, even if it doesn't necessarily deter the kinds of people who would engage in actual violence.
So we've talked about the increase in hate crimes, but another trend that's on the rise is the amount of anti-trans legislation that's been proposed in the last decade. Take a look at this. In the US alone, there have been over 25 times more anti-trans bills proposed so far this year than in all of 2015. These target everything from the right to use the bathroom matching one's gender identity to the right to participate in sports. But the few that actually do get passed often aim to control crucial aspects of life, like education and access to healthcare. So, Flora, do you think also, I would like to know, are police that are in countries with these hate crime laws, are they well educated enough on how to interact with these kinds of incidents?
So at least anecdotally, we think they're not. Police training is very lacking on lots of things, and we can certainly kind of draw conclusions from what happens in other kinds of offences that are not seen as classical crimes. So with gender-based violence in general, and particularly violence against women, we know you're very much in a postcode lottery situation. So it depends on where you are in the country, whether or not police are actually trained in dealing with more sensitive matters, sort of particularly around, say, sexual violence. We had a big scandal a few years ago where it emerged that someone was committing sexual offences against gay men. And by the time the police caught onto that, there were more than 100 victims. And a number of them had reported this to the police, but it simply hadn't been taken seriously. So it's not that the police are particularly well trained at dealing with anything that deviates from standard, say, property crime or more common kinds of violence. So, a fight outside the pub, for instance.
And earlier, Flora mentioned that in the UK there have been a lot of politicians who have been speaking about the trans community. In Taiwan, however, for example, in the lead up to the recent presidential and parliamentary elections, we didn't really see trans issues or many LGBTQ plus issues on the whole being discussed. Why do you think it's so different here, Po?
Well, I'll say these issues in Taiwan are still quite controversial, right? And bringing up these issues doesn't always bring you more votes. So for politicians, there aren't that much motivations to going on and have more conversations about LGBT rights right now after we just passed the gay marriage. Maybe not just, but I do feel like the politician and the society feels like it's just passed, and more discussion right now actually could deter a lot of public votes right now. So I'll say that's a big problem, because the majority of society feels like we are already really advanced and we don't need to do a lot more quickly.
So, Flora, many of our viewers and most people would probably consider anti-trans or anti-LGBTQ plus sentiments to be more something that we would hear from right-wing politicians. But in the UK, that hasn't quite been the situation recently. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, so it's quite interesting because people often lump the UK and the US together and assume politics works roughly similarly. They're both English-speaking countries in the global north. They have a close political relationship. But politics here works slightly differently, and it doesn't tend to split along the same kind of religious, in particular, fault lines when we think about the right wing, say, of the political spectrum. So they tend to not be overtly religious in this country. But concerns about trans inclusion were actually first raised by left-wing activists and by feminists and people involved in trade union politics in particular. And it came from a concern around women's equality in particular. So it came particularly from people who are interested in gender-based violence against women. And that's quite striking as a starting point, unlike the US, where this is clearly a right-wing religious issue. But more and more, so over the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen that this is now being picked up by right-wing politicians as well, and it's morphed into this broader kind of culture war politics. So the kind of same politicians who are now against trans people are also against migrants in this country, against the welfare state, against support for disabled people. So now it does look more like the US again, but there's still strong sentiment in some part of left-wing politics that seems to be against trans inclusion, which is very worrisome because that makes it much harder to tackle it as a problem.
Speaking to trans inclusion, I'd like to ask Po, do you feel that there's a disparity between the experiences of trans men and trans women, be it here in Taiwan or in the UK?
Yeah, I think it definitely do. We do share a lot of similarities, maybe coming out or having these relationship with healthcare systems. These are our similarities. But still, I feel like the society, maybe because of they value masculine more than feminine qualities. So when assigned female want to transition into a male, more masculine form, then they value it as a less threat than trans women transforming. And that is what I often think about because of the social discourse all really actually targeting trans women, from sports to private bathrooms, private women space. These are all very targeting trans women, and I often feel I want to help, but I'm not very clear which position is the best for us to stand at to like not hurting the women and also the trans women communities. Yeah, it's a difficult one.
What is medical access to both gender reassignment surgery and hormone replacement therapy like here in Taiwan?
Okay, so in Taiwan, although we have a national health insurance systems, all these gender affirming healthcare aren't included in the insurance. So it kind of depends on which doctor you see. Sometimes you're very lucky, then you will get your hormone paid by the insurance, but usually that's not the case. And because of these surgeries being self-paid, so it's actually quite expensive. So take me as an example, when I had my top surgery, it's like about 160 to 180,000 Taiwanese dollars. And that's actually a lot of money, and a lot of people can't access it because of financial reasons. As we said, like trans people are often having difficulties in entering job markets, right? And um, in general, if you want to have hormone in a like normal healthcare system, then you need at least one psychiatrist to give you an approve of like gender dysphoria diagnosis, and then you can start to take hormones. Yeah, that's the big picture of the healthcare in Taiwan.
So we've talked about hate crimes, laws, and statistics, but it's important to remember that behind each of those numbers is a person. We spoke to Marian, a transgender Taiwanese drag performer, to find out more about being trans here in Taiwan. Here's what she had to say.
我觉得台湾的跨性别目前生活其实都算蛮低调的耶，就是像我们很常看到欧美国家或是泰国的朋友，其实他们跨性别都还蛮高调的，就是然后穿的很就是很花，就是非常敢展现自己。对，但是在台湾跨性别朋友反而是我不希望人家我不希望人家知道我是跨性别，越少人知道越好。对，反而是觉得说，我希望我再像女生一点，这样就不会被人家认出来说我是跨性别这件事情。然后国外可能也是，但是台湾的这个想法会比较重一点，所以导致说很多跨性别朋友反而会比较很低调，不敢展现自己。
So, Po, Taiwan really prides itself on its just general openness about the LGBTQ plus community, as well as same-sex marriage and adoption rights. But at the same time, we just heard from Marian that in Taiwan, for the trans experience, it's not quite as open of a thing. More people hope, they aren't able to be recognized or aren't out about it. Do you think that you can explain why there's such a difference?
Well, I'll say firstly, even for my gay or lesbian friends, I don't feel like they would come out at their workplace that much compared to like maybe other Western countries. And I think there's another layer of difficulties for trans people to come out in just their like normal life in Taiwan, because people aren't that like understanding about what's transgender. And when you're trying to find a job, like if those people who interviews you or your boss doesn't actually understand what's transgender, it's really hard to like decide to come out, because you kind of need to start all the conversations again and answer those questions that's like microaggressive because they don't understand things. Yeah. And also like passing just as the other people just said, it's like the easiest way for people to live, and it's actually a privilege. So a lot of people want to keep it low file, but at the same time, if they want to live as themselves, it's very difficult.
So Flora, what do you think representation of members of marginalized communities does in order to help the situation for the members of those communities?
I think it's really important, but not just representation in the sense of, here's a character on TV, which can be influential. So in the UK, one thing that often gets brought up, that one of our first winners of the reality TV show Big Brother was actually a trans woman, and no one had any issues with that. She was very popular with the public. But I think it matters to also have representation in areas of power and influence. So politicians in particular, I think, is a really obvious one, because the more the people who make decisions for us represent the population that they're making decisions for, I think the better informed they are, the more nuanced they can be, and kind of the more supportive they can be of the wider population. And I would say the same thing around race or disability or sexual orientation in general, although we do have a lot of openly gay politicians in all political parties in this country, actually.
So speaking to that, Po, Taiwan's first trans minister, Audrey Tang, has kind of had an impact on people and perhaps how Taiwan view the transgender community. Do you think that her influence has been positive for the most part for the trans community?
Yeah, I'll say most part of it is very positive, because it brought transgender, like a transgender person that's like doing a normal job. Well, this is a very low standard, but it is what it is. So yeah, it brought people that like having a trans identity into the greater society, right? And that could brought up a lot of positive conversations. And like when I was still in Hotline, when we go out to schools to give talks, it's a very good example for people to think about transgender, but not just from those like negative news. Yeah, that's what I first could thought of. And I do also agree with Dr. Rain a lot, because like we do need more trans leaders in maybe like healthcare systems, academia, so like we could make sure all the decisions made about trans people are like engaged with trans people, not just like decided by the cisgender society, the cisgender community, which doesn't really like always understand the needs that good.
Flora, just having laws doesn't always mean that they work. What kinds of problems can you foresee with trying to attain trans rights?
So there's always a disconnect between law and policy. They don't necessarily follow from each other. So we've seen this quite recently. We have fairly strong anti-discrimination laws in this country, so you can't treat trans people differently just because they're trans. But the government keeps trying to introduce policies around education and around bathrooms. So they've come out in the last week that said, oh, trans women in particular, and that comes back to what Po said, the focus is always on trans women. So trans women should not be included in women's spaces. But that actually violates the Equality Act, which is anti-discrimination law. So in principle, that won't stand. It will likely, if it ever gets properly introduced, which may not happen, it would be subject to legal challenge and so the policy would be overturned. But that creates concerns for people, and it creates misinformation in the public. So people pick up what the government says and say, oh yeah, we can exclude trans people, but the law doesn't actually allow you to do this. So there is a real disconnect between the two. And just because you have good laws doesn't mean that they're going to be effective at all times and in all places.
So Flora, despite everything that we've talked about with all of the negatives with hate crimes and legislation, when we talked before, you told me that you still remain positive. Can you explain why?
So I think overall, certainly if we look at legal trends, we are moving in the right direction. And a number of European countries, as well as states in the US and in Canada, have introduced laws that make it easier for someone to change their gender marker, even sometimes to a non-binary designation, or to remove their gender marker entirely. And that's not had any bad consequences. So Ireland, which is very similar to the UK in lots of ways, introduced a self-ID law. So allowing people to identify themselves as the gender they want to be. And there has been absolutely no issue with that. So we know that these things aren't problematic. And I think overall, the trend is moving more in that direction. But we do at the same time have to be careful that we don't only focus on the positives and forget to tackle sort of the challenges that still exist. The UK is likely to have a change of government in the very near future towards a more left-wing government. And although they have not been great on trans issues, I do think they will eventually move in that direction again. The previous Labour governments introduced our equalities legislation that's still in force today, and which has been very progressive on a number of issues. So I remain hopeful that we can move past some of the current tensions.
Po, how do you feel about the future for transgender rights in Taiwan?
Well, I also feel mostly positive about things because things are gradually going into the right direction. Also, although we do have discourse in self-ID movement right now, but at least we are having these conversations, right? And I do think right now it's a very critical point because these conversations started to emerge, and it's a very good time to educate people about these things in the right way, and also tackle these anti-trans and discriminative language at this time.
Well, it's great to hear that in a world where we're hearing so much negativity that there are reasons to remain positive for the hopes for trans rights. And we're running out of time, but thank you so much, Dr. Flora Renz, Senior Lecturer in Law at the University of Kent and Co-Director of the Center for Sexuality, Race and Gender Justice in Canterbury, and Po, a Taiwanese graduate student at the London School for Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Thank you both for joining us. And for our viewers everywhere, it's been good to have your company. If you enjoyed today's episode or have anything you'd like to add to the dialogue, join the conversation on our social media. And remember, stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.